Crimson flames danced against the midnight sky, as explosions echoed across the tobacco fields like thunder on America's birthday. By dawn on July 5, 1856, the sprawling Thornfield Estate would be nothing but charred timber and twisted iron, its master's screams silenced forever beneath the weight of burning beams. This is the story of how Maris Elthorne transformed Independence Day into Judgment Day, turning the very symbols of American freedom into weapons against those who denied that freedom to others. The humid Georgia air carried the scent of gunpowder and smoke across Whitmore County as fireworks celebrated the nation's 80th birthday. Inside the grand columned mansion, crystal chandeliers reflected candlelight while silk rustled against polished oak floors. But in the quarters behind the house, where enslaved families huddled in stifling heat, rough cotton provided little comfort against walls that leaked summer storms through every crack. Tonight, one woman's rage would burn brighter than any firework, consuming everything in its path. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Georgia heat pressed against the earth like a suffocating blanket as Independence Day celebrations reached their crescendo across Whitmore County. Chinese rockets burst overhead in cascades of red, white, and blue, their echoes rolling across tobacco fields that stretched toward the Oconee River. The year 1856 had brought record heat to the antebellum South, and the Thornfield Estate stood as a monument to prosperity built on human bondage. Its whitewashed columns gleamed in the fading sunlight while Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds. Inside the mansion's grand ballroom, oil paintings of dead patriots gazed down upon living hypocrites who toasted freedom while owning other human beings. The irony was lost on Master Lucien Orival as he raised his crystal goblet toward the assembled guests, his weathered face flushed with bourbon and self-righteousness. At 43, Lucien commanded the respect that came with owning 200 acres of prime Georgia soil and the 89 souls who worked it without pay. The evening's festivities had drawn the county's elite to Thornfield's grand celebration. Carriages lined the circular drive while horses stamped impatiently in the humid air. Ladies in silk gowns fanned themselves against the oppressive heat, while gentlemen discussed cotton prices and political matters in voices that carried the casual authority of men who had never questioned their right to own other human beings. The sounds of celebration drifted across the plantation grounds, mixing with the distant thunder that promised another summer storm. In the servants' wing of the great house, 22-year-old Maris Elthorne moved through shadows that had become her permanent residence. Her calloused hands carried silver trays laden with delicacies she would never taste, while her bare feet navigated floors she had scrubbed countless times on hands and knees. The contrast between the celebration and her reality had never felt more stark. Tonight, as America celebrated 8 decades of independence, Maris found herself planning something that would transform this Independence Day into a very different kind of liberation. The mansion's construction told the story of Southern wealth in every hand-carved detail. Mahogany imported from Honduras gleamed under crystal chandeliers shipped from France. Persian rugs worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes covered floors polished by enslaved hands until they reflected like mirrors. Every luxury represented human suffering transformed into material comfort. Every beautiful object purchased with lives that the law refused to recognize as valuable. Maris had served in this house for 7 years, since Master Lucien purchased her at 15 from a failing plantation in South Carolina. She had learned to read the moods of wealthy white people the way sailors read weather patterns, understanding that survival depended on becoming invisible when anger flared and indispensable when needs arose. But tonight, as fireworks exploded overhead in celebration of American freedom, Maris no longer cared about survival, she cared about justice. The celebration reached its peak as Master Lucien called for attention from his position near the grand piano. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding both respect and obedience from everyone in his sphere of influence. The assembled guests turned toward their host with the deference that wealth and social position commanded in antebellum Georgia society. "My friends," Lucien declared, his words slightly slurred from an evening of celebration, "on this glorious 4th of July, we gather to celebrate the freedoms that make our great nation exceptional. the freedom to pursue prosperity, the freedom to maintain order, and the freedom to preserve the natural hierarchy that God has ordained for civilized society. The crowd murmured approval while Maris refilled wine glasses with mechanical precision. Her movements betrayed none of the revolutionary thoughts burning in her mind as she listened to Master Lucian speak of freedom while surrounded by people he owned like livestock. The irony burned in her chest like acid, but her face remained as impassive as stone. "Tonight," Lucian continued, warming to his theme, "we honor the Founding Fathers who understood that true liberty requires structure, discipline, and the proper ordering of society. They knew that some are born to lead while others are born to serve, and that this natural order ensures prosperity for all." Maris felt her grip tighten on the silver serving tray as Master Lucian's words echoed through the ballroom. She had heard variations of this speech countless times, but tonight the words carried a weight that pressed against her chest like a physical force. Around her, white faces nodded in agreement while they consumed food prepared by enslaved hands and served by people they considered property. The evening's entertainment included patriotic songs performed by young ladies whose musical education had been funded by human bondage. They sang of liberty and justice while their fathers counted profits from cotton fields worked by people who would never know either concept. The disconnect between words and reality created a cognitive dissonance that might have been amusing if it were not so tragic. As the formal dinner commenced, Maris observed the familiar ritual of Southern hospitality built on human suffering. The finest china held delicacies prepared in kitchens where enslaved women worked 16-hour days for no compensation beyond subsistence rations. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight while holding wine that cost more than most enslaved people could earn in a year if they had been paid for their labor. The guest list represented the pinnacle of Georgia society, including Judge Kalen Stravick, whose legal interpretations consistently favored slaveholder interests, and Colonel Valentino Ordrick, who commanded the local militia responsible for suppressing slave rebellions. Their presence at Thornfield's Independence Day celebration represented the intersection of legal, military, and economic power that maintained the peculiar institution. Mrs. Noel Draven, Master Lucian's wife, presided over the evening's social rituals with the practiced grace of Southern aristocracy. At 38, she had perfected the art of appearing genteel while overseeing a household built on systematic human exploitation. Her elaborate gowns and jewelry represented wealth extracted from enslaved labor, yet she moved through the evening as if her prosperity had materialized through divine blessing rather than human suffering. The children of the plantation elite played on the mansion's broad verandas, while their parents discussed politics and business inside. These young people had never known want or hunger, their comfortable lives built on foundations they would inherit without question. Their laughter mixed with the sounds of celebration as fireworks continued to burst overhead in commemoration of American independence. But in the quarters behind the great house, a different America existed. Here, 89 human beings owned by Master Lucian lived in conditions that mocked every principle the Founding Fathers had claimed to champion. Their log cabins leaked rain and cold, while the mansion blazed with imported luxuries. Their rations barely prevented starvation while the great house consumed delicacies that would feed entire families. Maris moved between these two worlds with the fluid invisibility that enslaved people had perfected as a survival mechanism. She existed in the spaces between comfort and suffering, serving those who denied her humanity, while maintaining the fiction that the system was natural and beneficial. But tonight, as America celebrated its independence, Maris had decided that her own liberation would begin. The evening's irony reached its crescendo as guests raised their glasses in toast to American freedom, while enslaved people cleared their plates and refilled their glasses. The founding documents spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as unalienable rights. Yet 3.5 million Americans remained in bondage, while their owners celebrated the very freedoms they denied to others. Yet, as midnight approached and the last fireworks faded from the summer sky, Maris began her final preparations for an Independence Day that would be remembered very differently by those who survived it. The celebration of American freedom was about to become something far more literal than Master Lucian had intended when he planned his elaborate 4th of July festivities. The morning sun rose over Georgia's cotton kingdom like a judgment day that never came. By 1856, the antebellum South had perfected a society built on human bondage, creating wealth that rivaled any civilization in history, while maintaining the fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution that benefited everyone involved. The Thornfield Estate exemplified this system's sophistication and moral blindness, sprawling across prime agricultural land that had been transformed from wilderness into profit through enslaved labor. Whitmore County occupied a strategic position in Georgia's agricultural economy, with the Oconee River providing transportation for crops destined for Savannah's export markets. The region's red clay soil proved ideal for tobacco cultivation, while the humid climate sustained cotton production that fed textile mills across New England and England. Master Lucien Orival had inherited this empire from his father, along with the unquestioned belief that human bondage represented the natural order of civilized society. The plantation's organization reflected generations of refinement in human exploitation. The great house dominated the landscape from its position atop a gentle rise, its Greek Revival architecture proclaiming the owner's cultural sophistication and economic power. Broad verandas wrapped around the structure like elegant arms, providing cooling shade during Georgia's oppressive summers, while offering commanding views of the fields where enslaved people labored from sunrise to sunset. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind the mansion, carefully planned outbuildings created a complex that functioned like a small city. The kitchen house stood separate from the main structure to prevent cooking fires from spreading, while the smokehouse, dairy, and other service buildings formed a courtyard where much of the plantation's domestic work occurred. These structures represented the hidden infrastructure that made plantation luxury possible, staffed by people whose skills and labor received no compensation beyond basic subsistence. The enslaved quarters occupied a different world entirely, hidden from the main house by strategic landscaping that preserved the owner's visual comfort while maintaining necessary proximity for labor access. Rows of log cabins housed families in spaces barely larger than the mansion's closets, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked during Georgia's frequent thunderstorms. The contrast between these living conditions and the great house's luxury represented the moral chasm that slaveholders refused to acknowledge. Georgia's legal framework had evolved to protect this system through increasingly sophisticated mechanisms of control and exploitation. The state's slave code regulated every aspect of enslaved people's lives, from their movements and associations to their access to education and religious worship. Reading remained illegal for enslaved people, while teaching them to read carried severe penalties that effectively eliminated opportunities for intellectual development that might threaten the system's stability. The patrol system created networks of surveillance that made escape extremely difficult while providing legal justification for violence against any enslaved person found away from their assigned location without proper documentation. Local militias, like the one commanded by Colonel Valentino Ordric, existed primarily to suppress slave rebellions, conducting regular drills that prepared white men for the possibility of armed resistance, while demonstrating the overwhelming force available to crush any uprising. Economic incentives aligned every aspect of white society with slavery's preservation and expansion. Banks provided credit for slave purchases while insurance companies offered policies that protected slaveholder investments against loss through death or escape. Professional slave traders operated openly in cities like Augusta and Savannah, conducting human auctions with the same attention to market dynamics that characterized any other commodity exchange. The domestic slave trade had become a massive industry by 1856, with enslaved people bred and sold like livestock to supply labor demands in expanding Western territories. Families were routinely separated for economic convenience, with parents sold away from their offspring and spouses divided by distances that made reunion impossible. This systematic destruction of family bonds served the dual purpose of increasing profits, while preventing the formation of kinship networks that might organize resistance. Religious institutions provided moral justification for human bondage through careful interpretation of biblical passages that seemed to endorse slavery while ignoring the faith's fundamental emphasis on human dignity and spiritual equality. Ministers like Reverend Magnus Thalros, who served Thornfield's local church, preached sermons that portrayed slavery as part of God's plan for racial harmony and mutual benefit, creating theological frameworks that eased slaveholder consciences while reinforcing their sense of divine blessing. Educational systems excluded enslaved people entirely while providing limited instruction for white women that emphasized domestic skills and social graces rather than intellectual development. Young men from slaveholding families attended universities that trained them for leadership roles in perpetuating the system, studying law, politics, and agricultural science that enhanced their ability to manage human property efficiently. The cotton economy created international connections that made slavery a global concern rather than merely a regional institution. British textile mills depended on American cotton, while northern manufacturers processed slave-grown crops into finished goods that generated profits throughout the supply chain. This economic interdependence meant that slavery's abolition would require systemic changes that extended far beyond the plantation South. Social hierarchies within the enslaved population reflected the system's sophistication in maintaining control through division and differential treatment. House servants like Maris occupied an ambiguous position that provided certain privileges while creating psychological distance from field hands who endured the harshest conditions. Skilled artisans commanded higher values and better treatment, while drivers and overseers of color received authority over other enslaved people in exchange for enforcing discipline. These internal divisions served multiple purposes for slaveholders, preventing unified resistance while creating incentives for cooperation with the system that oppressed everyone involved. The promise of advancement within slavery's hierarchy encouraged some enslaved people to identify with their owners' interests rather than organizing collective resistance, though such advancement remained limited and dependent on continued subjugation. Medical knowledge about enslaved people's health remained primitive and economically motivated, focused on maintaining productivity rather than ensuring genuine well-being. Plantation physicians like Dr. Jareth Fenlorn, who served multiple estates in Whitmore County, approached enslaved people's bodies as investments requiring maintenance rather than as human beings deserving care and dignity. Nutrition provided only the calories necessary for sustained labor, with protein and variety severely limited to reduce costs while preventing starvation that would damage property values. This calculated deprivation created chronic health problems that shortened lifespans while ensuring continued dependence on slaveholder-provided resources for survival. The legal fiction that enslaved people were simultaneously human beings subject to criminal law and property subject to commercial regulation created contradictions that revealed the system's fundamental irrationality. Enslaved people could be tried and executed for crimes while being bought and sold like livestock, creating a legal framework that acknowledged their humanity when convenient while denying it when profitable. Marriage between enslaved people carried no legal recognition, allowing owners to separate families for economic gain while preventing the formation of legal kinship networks that might provide protection or inheritance rights. This systematic destruction of family structures served both economic and control functions, maximizing slaveholder flexibility while minimizing enslaved people's ability to develop independent social organizations. The Underground Railroad operated through Whitmore County despite intense surveillance and severe penalties for anyone caught assisting escaped enslaved people. Safe houses and sympathetic individuals created networks that enabled some people to reach freedom in northern states or Canada, though the risks involved meant that only a small fraction of those seeking liberation ever succeeded in escaping slavery's reach. How? Cultural resistance flourished despite legal prohibitions, with enslaved people developing music, folklore, and religious practices that preserved African traditions while creating new forms of expression that provided psychological sustenance and community solidarity. These cultural formations remained largely invisible to white observers, who either ignored them entirely or misunderstood their significance as evidence of enslaved people's supposed contentment with their condition. By July 4, 1856, this complex system had reached a level of sophistication and entrenchment that made its supporters confident of its permanence. The Thornfield Estate represented the pinnacle of this achievement, combining maximum efficiency in human exploitation with cultural refinement that masked the violence underlying every aspect of plantation life. But within this seemingly stable system, forces were building that would soon test whether human bondage could truly endure indefinitely. Maris Elthorne learned to read in the shadows between moonlight and madness, stealing knowledge that could cost her life while serving people who considered her incapable of learning. Born into bondage at a failing rice plantation near Charleston, she had demonstrated an intelligence that made her valuable as household property while marking her as dangerous to those who preferred their human assets docile and ignorant. Her transfer to Thornfield at age 15 had saved her from the brutal field labor that killed most enslaved people before their 30th birthday, but it had also placed her in the intimate proximity to wealth and power that would ultimately prove explosive. At 22, Maris possessed the kind of beauty that made white men forget their wives and white women remember their vulnerability. Her skin held the warm bronze of Georgia clay kissed by sunlight, while her dark eyes reflected intelligence that slaveholders found both useful and threatening. She had learned to modulate her appearance like a survival tool, becoming invisible when danger approached while projecting competence when skills were needed. This ability to shift between personas had kept her alive through 7 years at Thornfield, but it had also allowed her to observe the plantation's operations with an intimacy that few enslaved people achieved. Master Lucian Orival commanded Thornfield Estate with the casual brutality of someone who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. At 43, he represented the third generation of Orvals to build wealth through human bondage, inheriting not just property but an entire worldview that justified systematic exploitation as natural and beneficial. His education at the University of Georgia had provided him with legal knowledge that he used to maximize profits from slave labor, while his social connections throughout the state's plantation elite ensured political protection for his interests. Lucian's physical presence dominated rooms through sheer force of personality backed by economic power that could destroy anyone who challenged his authority. Standing over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of someone who had never performed manual labor, he moved through the world with the confidence of absolute privilege. His weathered hands bore no calluses despite his claims of agricultural expertise, while his soft belly testified to decades of consuming food prepared by people who went hungry so he could feast. The master's cruelty manifested in calculated ways that revealed his intelligence, while demonstrating his complete lack of empathy for enslaved people's suffering. He understood that random violence was less effective than systematic brutality that followed clear patterns, creating predictable consequences that encouraged self-policing among his human property. His punishments were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while preserving the physical health necessary for continued productivity. Mrs. Noel Draven had married into the Orval family at 19, bringing a dowry of 30 enslaved people and social connections that enhanced Thornfield's political influence throughout Georgia. At 38, she had perfected the performance of Southern ladyhood while overseeing household operations that required intimate knowledge of human exploitation. Her delicate appearance concealed an iron will that made her perhaps more dangerous than her husband to those who served under her direct authority. Noel's education at a prestigious finishing school in Charleston had taught her to view enslaved people as extensions of her own will, rather than as human beings deserving moral consideration. She spoke to Maris and other house servants with the same tone she used for household pets, alternating between artificial affection and casual cruelty, depending on her mood and convenience. Her ability to switch between these personas without apparent awareness of the contradiction revealed the depth of her psychological disconnection from the humanity of those she owned. The mistress's daily routine involved elaborate self-care rituals that required constant attention from enslaved women who dressed her, styled her hair, and maintained her appearance while receiving no compensation beyond subsistence rations and periodic cast-off clothing. Noel's wardrobe alone represented more wealth than most enslaved families would see in multiple lifetimes, yet she complained constantly about the inadequacy of her possessions when compared to other plantation mistresses. Their eldest offspring, 19-year-old Siren Halreth, had inherited his father's sense of entitlement, along with additional cruelty that suggested psychological problems beyond normal socialization into slavery's violence. His treatment of enslaved people revealed sadistic tendencies that made even his parents uncomfortable, though they attributed his behavior to high spirits rather than recognizing the warning signs of serious mental disturbance. Siren's education at boarding schools in Virginia had exposed him to the intellectual currents that defended slavery through pseudo-scientific theories about racial hierarchies and social evolution. He quoted these theories with the enthusiasm of someone who had found academic justification for his own violent impulses, creating intellectual frameworks that made his cruelty seem rational rather than pathological. The youngest family member, 16-year-old Sapphira Dreneth, represented a different kind of danger to enslaved people through her unpredictable shifts between apparent sympathy and casual betrayal. She would engage Maris in conversations that seemed to recognize her humanity before reporting any perceived insolence to her parents for punishment. This pattern of false intimacy followed by betrayal created psychological torment that was perhaps more damaging than straightforward hostility. Safira's approaching marriage to a neighboring plantation heir had intensified household preparations that placed additional burdens on enslaved workers, while providing opportunities for the kind of mistakes that justified severe punishments. Her wedding would represent another generation's investment in slavery's continuation, binding two plantation fortunes together while ensuring that human bondage would persist into the next generation. Overseer Rowick Calvane managed Thornfield's day-to-day operations with the professional efficiency of someone who had dedicated his career to maximizing profits from human exploitation. A non-slaveholding white man from upcountry Georgia, he had risen through the plantation hierarchy by demonstrating an aptitude for violence that impressed even hardened slaveholders. His lack of personal investment in slavery's ideology made him perhaps more dangerous than true believers, since his motivation was purely economic rather than filtered through paternalistic self-deception. Rowick's knowledge of enslaved people's psychology allowed him to manipulate their behavior through carefully calibrated rewards and punishments that maintained productivity while preventing organized resistance. He understood that excessive brutality could provoke desperate reactions, while insufficient discipline encouraged the kind of independence that threatened plantation profitability. His success at balancing these forces had made him valuable to Master Lucian, while earning him the fear and hatred of everyone subject to his authority. The house staff included 6 other enslaved people whose relationships with Maris ranged from cautious friendship to competitive hostility, depending on their individual strategies for surviving bondage. Elmira Fenwick, the head cook, had achieved relative security through culinary skills that made her nearly irreplaceable, while Thesa Orvind, a seamstress, maintained her position through abilities that saved the family significant money on clothing and household textiles. These relationships were complicated by the constant surveillance that made genuine friendship dangerous, while creating incentives for reporting others' behavior to gain favor with white authority figures. Trust became a luxury that few enslaved people could afford, since any confidence shared with the wrong person could result in severe punishment or sail away from the only community they knew. The field hands who worked Thornfield's tobacco and cotton crops remained largely separate from house servants, creating social divisions that served slaveholder interests while reflecting real differences in daily experiences and survival strategies. Maris's position allowed her occasional contact with these workers during busy seasons, but the social distance maintained between different categories of enslaved people limited opportunities for unified resistance, while reinforcing hierarchies that benefited no one except their owners. Among the field hands, natural leaders like Jareth Fenlorn had emerged through intelligence and charisma that made them valuable for organizing work details while marking them as potential threats to plantation security. These individuals walked careful lines between providing necessary leadership and avoiding the kind of prominence that might provoke violent suppression from white authorities. The enslaved community's survival depended on complex networks of mutual support that operated beneath the surface of daily life, providing emotional sustenance and practical assistance while remaining invisible to white observers. These networks included religious gatherings that combined Christian worship with African traditions, informal economic systems that allowed limited accumulation of personal property, and communication systems that spread information throughout the plantation faster than any official channels. Maris's literacy set her apart from most other enslaved people while creating both opportunities and dangers that shaped her daily existence. Her ability to read Master Lucian's correspondence had provided her with knowledge about plantation finances and plans that could prove valuable for survival or resistance, but discovery of her literacy would result in punishment severe enough to serve as an example to others who might seek forbidden knowledge. This combination of intelligence, beauty, and dangerous knowledge had placed Maris in a unique position within Thornfield's social hierarchy, close enough to power to understand its operations, while remaining sufficiently powerless to be subject to its arbitrary violence. By July 4, 1856, this position had become unsustainable, creating pressures that would soon explode into something that no one at Thornfield was prepared to contain. The morning after Independence Day dawned with the oppressive heat that made Georgia summers legendary for their ability to break both spirit and flesh. Maris began her duties before sunrise, as she had every day for the past 7 years, but something fundamental had shifted during the night's celebration. The irony of white people toasting freedom while owning other human beings had crystallized into a rage so pure it felt like religious conversion, transforming her from someone who endured oppression into someone who would no longer accept it. The household's return to normal routine after the festivities revealed the systematic nature of the cruelty that Maris had learned to navigate through careful invisibility and perfect compliance. Master Lucian's morning inspection of the enslaved quarters followed the same pattern he had established years earlier, designed to reinforce his absolute authority while identifying any signs of insubordination that might require violent correction. His scrutiny of living conditions was not motivated by concern for human welfare, but by the need to maintain his human property in working condition. Each cabin received the same dismissive evaluation, with Lucian noting broken items that would be deducted from already inadequate rations rather than repaired at his expense. The leaking roof that made Elmira Fenwick's quarters uninhabitable during rainstorms was declared a maintenance priority that would be addressed when convenient, meaning never. The broken window in Thesa Orvan's cabin was deemed unnecessary for people who had no right to privacy or comfort beyond basic survival needs. Maris watched these inspections from the mansion's kitchen windows, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks while her mind processed the casual indifference that characterized Master Lucian's treatment of human beings he owned like livestock. She had witnessed these scenes countless times before, but now they struck her with the force of moral revelation. The system that sustained Thornfield's prosperity required the systematic degradation of everything that made life worth living for 9/10 of the people who called the plantation home. The week following Independence Day brought additional pressures that revealed the plantation's economic priorities with crystalline clarity. Master Lucian's correspondence, which Maris read while dusting his office, discussed plans for expanding cotton production that would require longer working hours and increased productivity quotas from field hands already working from dawn until dusk. The letters revealed casual discussions of human beings as production units, whose suffering was relevant only insofar as it affected their economic output. One particular letter from a cotton broker in Savannah provided detailed market analysis that treated enslaved people's lives as mathematical variables in profit calculations. The correspondence discussed optimal nutrition levels that would maintain productivity while minimizing food costs, medical care that would preserve property values while avoiding unnecessary expenses, and breeding programs that would increase the plantation's human inventory while maximizing genetic traits that enhanced commercial value. Mrs. Noel Draven's preparation for her daughter's wedding had intensified the household's already demanding work schedule, creating additional opportunities for the kind of minor mistakes that justified severe punishments. The mistress's increasingly elaborate demands for perfection in every detail of domestic management had reached levels that made satisfaction impossible, ensuring that someone would fail to meet her standards and require disciplinary action that would serve as an example to others. The wedding preparations revealed the obscene wealth that slavery had concentrated in the hands of families like the Orvalls, with expenses for a single day's celebration exceeding what most enslaved people could earn in multiple lifetimes if they had been compensated for their labor. Crystal imported from Ireland, silk shipped from France, and delicacies sourced from across the globe would create an event that demonstrated the family's social status while celebrating another generation's investment in human bondage. Maris's role in these preparations required her to handle objects worth more than the combined value that Master Lucian had assigned to several enslaved families, creating cognitive dissonance that made the system's fundamental irrationality impossible to ignore. She polished silver candlesticks that cost more than a year's food for the entire enslaved community, while being forbidden to own anything more valuable than the rough clothing that barely protected her from Georgia's weather extremes. The increased workload had pushed several enslaved people beyond their physical limits, resulting in the kind of health problems that Master Lucian addressed through threats rather than medical care. Old Samuel's persistent cough had worsened to the point where blood appeared regularly in his sputum, but requests for medical attention were dismissed as malingering that deserved punishment rather than treatment. The brutal logic of slavery meant that enslaved people's health was relevant only when their productivity declined enough to affect profits. Young Marcus Thornfield, barely 17 years old, had collapsed in the cotton fields during the previous week's harvest work, his body unable to sustain the pace that overseer Rowett Calvane demanded during the crucial period when cotton prices peaked in Savannah's export markets. Rather than providing rest and recovery time, Marcus received additional work assignments designed to teach him the consequences of failing to meet productivity expectations, regardless of physical limitations. The punishment systems that governed daily life at Thornfield had intensified as Master Lucian sought to maximize profits from the upcoming cotton harvest while preparing for wedding expenses that would strain even the plantation's substantial resources. Rations were reduced to levels that barely prevented starvation, while working hours extended deeper into Georgia's oppressive summer heat. Any protest or sign of resistance met with violent consequences designed to terrorize others into compliance. Maris witnessed Thessa Orvand receive 20 lashes for accidentally tearing a silk dress during routine mending work, the punishment administered in full view of other house servants to ensure the lesson was understood by everyone present. The whipping left permanent scars that would serve as constant reminders of the price of any mistake, no matter how minor or unintentional. The casual brutality with which this violence was administered revealed how completely Master Lucian had disconnected from the humanity of those he owned. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance had created an atmosphere where even enslaved people turned against each other in desperate attempts to avoid punishment by directing Master Lucian's attention toward others' real or imagined transgressions. Trust became a luxury that few could afford when survival depended on staying below the radar of white authority figures who viewed any sign of independence as a threat requiring violent suppression. Elmira Fenwick's discovery that someone had been stealing scraps from the kitchen garbage created a crisis that revealed the desperation driving people to risk severe punishment for small amounts of food that would normally be fed to pigs. Master Lucian's response was to reduce everyone's rations, while implementing additional surveillance measures that made the already oppressive atmosphere even more suffocating. The investigation into the stolen food revealed the complex moral compromises that slavery forced upon its victims, with people who should have been natural allies competing for survival in a system designed to pit them against each other. Accusations and counter-accusations created divisions within the enslaved community that served Master Lucian's interests while destroying the solidarity that might have enabled effective resistance. Religious services that had once provided spiritual comfort and community solidarity became another arena for surveillance and control, with Master Lucian's appointed preacher delivering sermons that emphasized obedience and acceptance while promising heavenly rewards for earthly suffering. The corruption of spiritual life represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of slavery's totalitarian reach, corrupting even the resources that might have provided psychological resistance to systematic oppression. The wedding's approach had brought additional white visitors to Thornfield, including potential buyers who evaluated enslaved people with the dispassionate expertise of livestock traders assessing commercial prospects. Maris endured the humiliation of being examined like a breeding animal, while white men discussed her value and potential uses with the casual objectivity reserved for inanimate property. These evaluations included physical examinations that violated every concept of human dignity while serving the purely economic function of determining market values for potential transactions. The buyers' conversations revealed plans for westward expansion that would require separation of families and transportation to territories where escape would be virtually impossible due to geographic isolation and hostile white populations. Master Lucian's financial records, which Maris accessed during her cleaning duties, revealed mounting debts that made the sale of enslaved people increasingly likely as he sought to maintain his lifestyle while meeting wedding expenses that had spiraled beyond original estimates. The casual manner in which he planned to destroy families for financial convenience demonstrated the complete moral bankruptcy that characterized the slaveholding class. The pressure had also affected relationships within the Orval family, with Master Lucian's violence toward Noel increasing as financial stress created additional tensions that he resolved through the same physical brutality he used to control enslaved people. Maris had cleaned blood from surfaces and clothing that testified to domestic violence that was simultaneously denied and normalized within the plantation's social hierarchy. Young Siren Halreth's behavior had grown increasingly erratic as he approached his 20th birthday, with violent outbursts that targeted enslaved people with a sadistic creativity that disturbed even his parents. His psychological instability represented a different kind of danger than systematic oppression, introducing unpredictable elements that made survival strategies based on understanding patterns and expectations increasingly inadequate. By mid-July, the convergence of economic pressure, increased workload, family violence, and psychological instability had created conditions that made some form of explosion inevitable. The question was not whether the system would reach a breaking point, but what form that explosion would take and who would survive its consequences. For Maris, the answer was becoming increasingly clear with each passing day of humiliation and violence. The afternoon heat on July 20th, 1856, pressed against Thornfield Estate like the weight of accumulated sins demanding judgment. Maris moved through the mansion's corridors with the mechanical precision that 7 years of bondage had burned into her muscle memory. But beneath the surface of perfect compliance, revolutionary thoughts crystallized with each breath of the suffocating air. The wedding preparations had reached a fever pitch that made normal plantation operations seem peaceful by comparison, creating opportunities for the kind of oversight that would soon prove catastrophic. Master Lucian had called a meeting with his cotton broker and the local banker to discuss financing arrangements for the upcoming harvest, unaware that his most valuable house servant possessed the literacy skills necessary to understand every word of their conversation. Maris positioned herself in the adjoining study, ostensibly organizing Master Lucian's correspondence, while actually eavesdropping on negotiations that would determine the fate of every person living in bondage at Thornfield. The men's voices carried clearly through the thin walls as they discussed market conditions, with the casual indifference of people accustomed to treating human suffering as a mathematical variable in profit calculations. Cotton prices had reached unprecedented levels in international markets, creating opportunities for massive wealth accumulation that required only the complete exploitation of enslaved labor to achieve maximum returns on their human investments. The Manchester mills are paying premium rates for quality fiber, noted Charles Pemberton, the cotton broker whose expertise in agricultural commodities had made him wealthy through commissions earned from human misery. If we can increase production by 30%, the profits will exceed anything we've achieved in previous seasons. Master Lucian leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with the avarice that drove every decision affecting the 89 human beings he owned like livestock. What would that require in terms of additional labor hours and productivity quotas? 16-hour workdays during harvest season, Pemberton replied without hesitation, dawn to dusk in the fields, with additional time for processing and preparation. The workers can rest when the cotton is sold and profits are secured. The banker, Harrison Webb, consulted his leather-bound ledger with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reducing human lives to financial entries. The increased production would generate sufficient revenue to cover expansion costs, while providing capital for additional land acquisition and property purchases. Maris felt her hands grow cold despite the oppressive heat as the full meaning of their conversation penetrated her consciousness. These men were discussing the systematic destruction of human lives with the same casual attention they might give to crop rotation or equipment maintenance. The enslaved people whose labor would generate their profits were not even considered as participants in decisions that would determine whether they lived or died from exhaustion. "What about the weak ones who can't maintain the pace?" Master Lucian asked, his tone suggesting genuine concern for productivity rather than human welfare. "We've already lost 2 field hands this season to what the overseer calls natural causes." "Acceptable losses," Webb replied with the financial expertise that had made him indispensable to the county's plantation elite. "Property insurance will cover replacement costs, while the increased productivity from the survivors will more than compensate for any reduction in inventory numbers." The casual reference to human deaths as acceptable losses struck Maris with physical force, causing her to grip the desk edge to maintain her balance. These men were planning systematic murder disguised as agricultural improvement, calculating the point at which human lives became expendable in pursuit of maximum profits from cotton sales. Pemberton's next comment revealed the true scope of their intentions. "The beauty of this approach is that we can blame any deaths on natural causes rather than acknowledging the role of working conditions. The coroner has been very cooperative in previous situations where productivity requirements exceeded human endurance." Master Lucian chuckled with the satisfied amusement of someone who had discovered an elegant solution to a complex problem. "Excellent! And if we time the harvest correctly, we can complete cotton sales before wedding expenses require additional capital, allowing us to maintain our social obligations while maximizing agricultural profits. Mays. The wedding reference crystallized Maris's understanding of the moral universe that governed these men's decisions. They were willing to kill enslaved people through systematic overwork in order to finance a celebration that would cost more than most families would see in multiple lifetimes. The brutal mathematics of their planning revealed complete indifference to human suffering that exceeded anything she had previously imagined possible. There is one additional consideration, Webb noted, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone reserved for discussions of particularly sensitive subjects. Some of the property may require, shall we say, enhanced motivation to achieve the productivity levels we're discussing. Master Lucian's response revealed his enthusiasm for the violent enforcement that would make their plans possible. Rawick has been very effective in that regard. I've given him complete authority to use whatever methods he deems necessary to maintain discipline and productivity. The conversation's direction made Maris's stomach clench with terror as she realized they were discussing the systematic torture of people she had known for years, individuals whose only crime was being born into a society that refused to recognize their humanity. The plantation's overseer had already demonstrated sadistic tendencies that made regular discipline sessions exercises in organized brutality rather than mere punishment. Pemberton's contribution to this discussion revealed the breadth of white society's complicity in slavery's violence. The sheriff has assured me that local law enforcement will not interfere with plantation discipline, regardless of the methods employed or the results achieved. Property rights supersede all other considerations. The legal framework that protected slaveholder violence while criminalizing enslaved resistance meant that Master Lucian possessed unlimited authority to inflict suffering without consequences, while any attempt at self-defense would result in execution administered with the full force of state power. The system had been designed to ensure that justice could flow in only one direction, protecting oppressors while condemning their victims. Master Lucian's next words revealed the timeline that would transform these plans from theoretical discussions into deadly reality. We'll implement the new schedule beginning August 1st, allowing maximum time for harvest completion before weather conditions deteriorate. Anyone who fails to meet productivity expectations will receive enhanced correction until their performance improves or they are no longer capable of working. The euphemistic language could not disguise the fact that they were planning systematic murder through overwork, torture, and deliberate neglect of human needs. The enhanced correction that Master Lucian described so casually would involve the kind of violence that left permanent physical and psychological damage on those who survived it. Webb's final contribution to their planning session revealed the economic calculations that made human lives completely expendable in pursuit of profit maximization. The insurance policies will cover replacement costs for any property losses, while the increased revenue from expanded production will generate sufficient capital for westward expansion into territories where land costs remain affordable. This reference to westward expansion revealed plans that extended beyond immediate profit to long-term wealth accumulation that would require the destruction of additional human lives in pursuit of agricultural empire building. The men in this room were planning to spread slavery's violence across an entire continent, treating the suffering of future generations as acceptable costs for their personal enrichment. The meeting's conclusion left Maris with knowledge that made continued passive compliance impossible. She had heard these men plan systematic murder disguised as agricultural improvement, discussing the torture and death of people she had known for years with the casual indifference they might show toward broken farm equipment. The moral weight of this knowledge demanded action that would either free her from complicity or destroy her in the attempt. As the men departed to finalize their arrangements, Maris remained in the study with her cleaning supplies, but her thoughts had moved far beyond domestic duties, toward possibilities that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The plantation's physical layout, the locations of flammable materials, the patterns of white surveillance, and the timing of security routines had become elements in calculations that would soon transform Thornfield Estate from a monument to human oppression into something very different. On Chrome, the afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on Georgia's red clay soil as Maris completed her assigned tasks with mechanical precision. But beneath the surface of perfect compliance, she was already planning the Independence Day that would finally live up to its name. The revolution that America's founding fathers had started but failed to complete was about to receive the kind of finishing that only someone who had nothing left to lose could provide. That evening, as twilight settled over the plantation like a shroud, Maris began the careful preparations that would transform her from property into something that property owners would never see coming. The time for endurance had ended. The time for action had arrived with the inevitability of sunrise after the longest night in human history. The days following the overheard conversation passed with deceptive normalcy, as Maris maintained her routine of perfect compliance, while secretly conducting reconnaissance that would determine whether her developing plan could succeed without detection. Every room she cleaned became a potential battlefield, every task an opportunity to assess vulnerabilities that 7 years of intimate knowledge had revealed about Thornfield's operations. The mansion's layout, built for comfort and display rather than security, offered numerous possibilities for someone with unrestricted access and nothing left to lose. Master Lucian's study contained detailed maps of the plantation that Maris examined during her daily cleaning, memorizing the locations of outbuildings, storage facilities, and the quarters where 89 human beings would need time to escape before flames made survival impossible. The cotton warehouses stood downwind from the main house, their wooden construction and stored fiber, creating perfect conditions for fires that would spread faster than any response could contain them. The tobacco barns, filled with cured leaves awaiting market transport, represented months of enslaved labor that could be destroyed in minutes under the right conditions. The mansion itself had been constructed with the kind of luxury materials that burned readily once ignited, from the imported hardwood floors to the silk draperies that Master Lucian had ordered from Charleston's finest merchants. Persian rugs worth more than most people would earn in their entire lifetimes covered floors throughout the house, while oil paintings and gilt frames decorated walls that would feed flames with the enthusiasm of tinder prepared for a campfire. Maris's access to the wine cellar during her duties provided her with detailed knowledge of the storage areas beneath the house, where Master Lucian kept not only his collection of imported spirits, but also various household supplies that included lamp oil, turpentine, and other flammable substances that could accelerate fire beyond any hope of control. The cellar's ventilation system would create perfect conditions for flames to spread upward through the house's structure, while preventing easy escape for anyone trapped on upper floors. The timing of her action required careful consideration of multiple factors that could determine success or failure. The wedding preparations had created unusual activity patterns that provided both opportunities and risks, with additional white visitors potentially complicating escape, while also creating distractions that might delay discovery of the fires until they had progressed beyond containment. The household's routine during late July included evening gatherings that kept the family and their guests occupied in specific areas, while servants completed final preparations in other parts of the mansion. Weather conditions would play a crucial role in determining how quickly fires spread and whether prevailing winds would carry flames toward the enslaved quarters before their inhabitants could reach safety. The summer's drought had left vegetation particularly susceptible to ignition, while recent thunderstorms had passed without significant rainfall that might dampen the extensive timber construction that characterized most plantation buildings. Maris began collecting materials with the methodical patience of someone who understood that hasty action would result in discovery and execution before any meaningful damage could be achieved. Candle stubs accumulated in her quarters as she claimed responsibility for replacing partially burned candles throughout the house, creating a supply of reliable ignition sources that would not be missed until too late to prevent their use. Kitchen oil designated for cooking provided another resource that could be obtained in small quantities without arousing suspicion, since her duties included food preparation that required various cooking fats and oils. The kitchen's supplies also included items like flour and cornmeal that could create explosive conditions when dispersed properly in enclosed spaces, knowledge that Maris had acquired through observations of accidental kitchen fires that had required quick suppression. The mansion's numerous fireplaces contained materials that could be repurposed for accelerating flames, including kindling, newspaper, and the coal oil used to start fires during Georgia's brief winter season. These supplies were stored throughout the house in quantities that would not be inventoried closely enough to reveal small-scale theft, particularly during the chaos of wedding preparations that had disrupted normal household routines. Maris's literacy provided her with access to Master Lucian's correspondence that revealed his schedule and that of his family, allowing her to identify periods when the house would be occupied in predictable patterns that could either facilitate or complicate her plans. The letters also contained information about security arrangements, including the timing of overseer patrols and the location of weapons that might be used to suppress slave rebellions. The plantation's isolation worked both for and against her intentions, providing distance from potential outside assistance, while also ensuring that fires would have time to establish themselves before help could arrive from neighboring properties. The nearest town lay 12 miles away over roads that became nearly impassable during summer rainstorms, while the closest neighbor lived far enough away that flames would need to reach extraordinary heights before being visible from adjacent properties. Communication between plantations relied on slave messengers who traveled established routes according to schedules that Maris had observed during her years at Thornfield, providing her with knowledge of when outside contact might bring unwanted attention to unusual activities. The timing of her action would need to account for these communication patterns, while ensuring that escaping enslaved people had sufficient time to reach safety before pursuit could be organized. The quarters, location relative to the main house, represented a critical factor in determining whether her plan would result in liberation or massacre for the people she sought to free from bondage. The prevailing wind patterns during late July typically carried smoke and flames away from the quarters toward the river, but sudden weather changes could reverse this protection and trap people between advancing fires and the armed white men who would inevitably respond to news of slave rebellion. Maris's observations of the white community's response to previous emergencies revealed patterns that could be exploited to maximize confusion while minimizing organized resistance to escaping enslaved people. Fire created panic that disrupted normal command structures, while the preservation of property took precedence over pursuit of human beings who might escape during the chaos of fighting flames that threatened valuable assets. The psychological preparation required for her plan demanded confronting the reality that some white people would die in fires that she deliberately set, including individuals who had shown her small kindnesses during her years of bondage. Mrs. Noel Draven's occasional expressions of concern for enslaved people's welfare could not erase her fundamental complicity in their oppression, while young Sapphira Dreneth's apparent sympathy had always been conditional on maintaining her own privileged position. Master Lucian's children represented a particular moral challenge, since their deaths would end lives that had barely begun, despite their thorough indoctrination into slavery's violence. But Maris had witnessed young Siren Halreth's casual cruelty toward enslaved people, and heard Sapphira's reports of conversations that had resulted in severe punishments for people whose only crime was speaking honestly about their condition. The decision to include the family quarters in her plans reflected a calculation that mercy toward individual oppressors would perpetuate systematic oppression that killed dozens of enslaved people every year through overwork, malnutrition, and violence. The mathematics of liberation required accepting responsibility for ending lives that had been built on the destruction of other lives, creating moral equations that allowed no perfect solutions. Religious considerations provided both justification and torment, as Maris contemplated actions that violated Christian teachings about forgiveness while potentially serving the cause of justice that those same teachings demanded. The biblical passages that supported slavery's continuation had been selected and interpreted by white people who benefited from enslaved labor, while other passages spoke of liberation from bondage and judgment upon oppressors. The enslaved community's reaction to her plans remained unknowable, since discussing such intentions would result in immediate betrayal by someone seeking to avoid collective punishment that typically followed discovery of rebellious activities. Trust had become a luxury that few enslaved people could afford, when survival depended on maintaining individual relationships with white authority figures who possessed absolute power over life and death. Maris's isolation within her own community reflected slavery's success in preventing the kind of unified resistance that might threaten the system's stability. But it also protected other enslaved people from knowledge that could result in their execution if her plans were discovered before implementation. The responsibility for action and consequences would rest entirely on her shoulders, removing any possibility that others would suffer for her choices. The practical mechanics of her plan required coordinating multiple fires that would overwhelm any response while providing maximum time for people to escape before flames blocked potential routes to safety. The sequence of ignition would begin with the cotton warehouses and tobacco barns, creating dramatic displays that would draw attention away from the main house while ensuring destruction of the year's crops that represented Master Lucian's primary source of revenue. The mansion fires would follow after sufficient time had passed for the enslaved quarters to empty, with ignition points selected to ensure rapid spread through the house's interior, while trapping occupants on upper floors, where escape would require jumping from heights that made survival unlikely. The cellar fires would be set last, using accumulated flammable materials to create explosions that would prevent any attempt to fight the flames from below. Timing would be crucial to prevent premature discovery while ensuring that all elements of the plan could be implemented before alarm could be raised and countermeasures organized. The process would require approximately 2 hours from initial ignition to complete implementation, during which Maris would need to move through the plantation with the same apparent normalcy that had characterized her daily routines for 7 years. The escape routes available to fleeing enslaved people led primarily toward the river and the swamplands beyond, terrain that would provide concealment while making pursuit difficult for mounted searchers unfamiliar with paths that enslaved people had used for hunting and gathering activities. The network of waterways provided transportation deeper into areas where organized search efforts would become impractical. As the final week of July approached, Maris completed her preparations with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that failure would result in torture and execution, while success would transform her from property into legend. The accumulated materials waited in carefully selected hiding places throughout the plantation, while her knowledge of schedules and routines had been refined to precision that would allow maximum impact, with minimum risk of premature discovery. The anniversary of American independence was approaching once again, providing symbolic resonance that would make her actions impossible to ignore or minimize as random violence rather than deliberate political statement. The 4th of July would finally fulfill its promise of liberation for people who had been excluded from freedom's benefits while bearing all of its costs. Everything was ready for the night when Thornfield Estate would learn the true meaning of independence, and when Maris Elthorne would transform from enslaved property into something that property owners would never see coming until it was far too late to prevent the reckoning that their own choices had made inevitable. The 4th of July, 1857 dawned with the oppressive humidity that made Georgia summers legendary for their ability to break both spirit and flesh, but Maris Elthorne felt none of the usual weight that typically accompanied her morning duties. Today carried the crystalline clarity that comes to people who have moved beyond fear into the realm of absolute purpose, where survival becomes less important than ensuring that truth finally receives its due recognition through actions that cannot be ignored or forgotten. The Orval family's second annual Independence Day celebration had drawn even more guests than the previous year, with carriages arriving throughout the afternoon as plantation owners and their families gathered to toast American freedom while maintaining their investments in human bondage. The irony had lost none of its bitter edge during the 12 months since Maris first recognized the fundamental contradiction between America's founding principles and the reality of her daily existence. Master Lucian's mood reflected satisfaction with the plantation's financial performance during the previous harvest season, which had generated profits that exceeded even his optimistic projections. The increased productivity quotas and extended working hours had achieved their intended results, though at a cost measured in human suffering that never appeared in the account books that recorded his growing wealth. 3 enslaved people had died from exhaustion during the cotton harvest, but their deaths had been attributed to natural causes rather than the systematic overwork that actually killed them. The day's festivities began with a reading of the Declaration of Independence that Master Lucian performed with theatrical flourish, his voice rising with patriotic fervor as he recited passages about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to an audience that denied these rights to 89 human beings working within sight of the mansion's broad verandas. The assembled guests applauded enthusiastically, while enslaved people served refreshments that represented more wealth than most of them would see in their entire lifetimes. Maris moved through these scenes with the practiced invisibility that had protected her for 8 years, but now her observation served a different purpose than mere survival. Every detail of the gathering's organization, from the timing of meal service to the patterns of guest movement throughout the house, became elements in calculations that would soon transform this celebration into something entirely different from what Master Lucian had planned. The afternoon's entertainment included patriotic speeches that praised the Founding Fathers, wisdom in creating a government that protected property rights and maintained social order through the proper subordination of inferior races to their natural superiors. Judge Kalen Stravick delivered a particularly eloquent address that portrayed slavery as evidence of American democracy's strength rather than its fundamental contradiction, arguing that true freedom required the careful regulation of those incapable of governing themselves responsibly. As evening approached and the promised fireworks display prepared to begin, Maris excused herself from serving duties with the complaint of stomach illness that had provided cover for her final preparations during the previous week. Mrs. Noel Draven dismissed her with the casual indifference she showed toward all enslaved people's health concerns, instructing her to return to the quarters until she was fit for proper service. This dismissal provided exactly the freedom of movement that Maris needed to implement plans that had been refined through weeks of careful observation and preparation. The guests' attention was focused entirely on the pyrotechnic display that would illuminate the night sky in celebration of American independence, creating perfect conditions for actions that would give new meaning to the concept of liberation. The cotton warehouses stood approximately 200 yards from the main house, far enough to prevent immediate discovery, while close enough to ensure that flames would be visible from the mansion once they achieved sufficient intensity. The wooden construction and stored fiber created ideal conditions for fires that would spread faster than any response could contain them, particularly during the drought conditions that had left all vegetation susceptible to ignition. Maris approached the first warehouse with candle stubs and cooking oil that she had accumulated during weeks of careful preparation, her movements calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to unleash. The door opened easily since security measures were designed to prevent theft rather than sabotage, and the interior contained exactly the materials she had expected based on her observations of harvest activities. The ignition process began with oil poured across stored cotton bales in patterns that would ensure rapid spread throughout the building's interior, followed by placement of lit candles in positions that would prevent easy extinguishing while maximizing contact with flammable materials. The flames caught immediately, racing across the oil-soaked cotton with an enthusiasm that exceeded even her careful calculations. She moved to the second warehouse with methodical precision, repeating the process while smoke from the first building began to billow into the night sky. The tobacco barns required similar treatment, though the cured leaves created different burning characteristics that filled the air with thick smoke that would soon alert everyone on the plantation to the presence of fires too large to control through normal suppression methods. The timing of these initial fires had been calculated to draw attention away from the main house, while providing sufficient warning for enslaved people to begin evacuation procedures that would take them away from areas where flames might spread. The prevailing wind carried smoke toward the river rather than the quarters, creating conditions that would allow maximum time for escape before pursuit could be organized. 20 minutes passed between the first ignition and Maris's approach to the mansion, during which time the warehouse fires had achieved intensity that made them visible from neighboring plantations, while creating smoke columns that rose hundreds of feet into the evening sky. The guests had noticed the unusual illumination and were beginning to investigate its source when she entered the house through the kitchen entrance. The mansion's interior layout had been memorized through 8 years of daily cleaning that provided intimate knowledge of every room, corridor, and storage area. The wine cellar contained lamp oil and turpentine that she had gradually accumulated in quantities sufficient to create explosions that would prevent any attempt to fight flames from the foundation level upward. Her movements through the house maintained the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her daily duties, but now each step served the purpose of systematic destruction rather than domestic maintenance. The cellar fires were set first, using flammable liquids to create conditions that would send flames shooting upward through the building's timber frame structure with unstoppable force. The main floor fires followed a pattern designed to block escape routes while ensuring rapid spread to upper levels where the family and their guests would be trapped by flames that offered no possibility of survival. The imported silk draperies that Master Lucian had ordered from Charleston burned with particular enthusiasm, creating walls of fire that separated different areas of the house while feeding on luxury materials that represented wealth extracted from enslaved labor. The Persian rugs that covered the floors throughout the mansion provided perfect accelerants for flames that raced from room to room with mathematical precision, consuming years of accumulated wealth in minutes, while creating heat that made the upper floors uninhabitable for anyone who might seek refuge there. Oil paintings in gilt frames fed the fires with the concentrated energy of artistic beauty transformed into instruments of justice. Maris climbed the main staircase for the final time as flames began to consume the first floor beneath her feet, the mahogany banister already growing warm to the touch as fire found the seasoned hardwood that Master Lucian had imported at enormous expense. Her destination was the master bedroom where account books and correspondence documented 8 years of systematic human exploitation that would finally receive appropriate judgment. The bedroom fires were set with particular care to ensure that financial records would be destroyed along with the people who had created them, eliminating evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted while providing symbolic completion to justice that legal systems had refused to deliver. Master Lucian's desk contained documentation of slave purchases, breeding programs, and productivity calculations that reduced human beings to mathematical variables and profit equations. These papers burned first, along with correspondence from other plantation owners that revealed the scope of collaboration in maintaining systems that treated people as property while denying them recognition as human beings deserving moral consideration. The destruction of these records would complicate any investigation while eliminating evidence that might be used to capture enslaved people who had escaped during the chaos. By this time, smoke had begun to penetrate the house's upper levels, where guests and family members were finally beginning to understand that their situation had moved beyond inconvenience into genuine danger. Voices could be heard through the thickening smoke as people attempted to locate escape routes that were already blocked by flames that had achieved temperatures incompatible with human survival. Yaktwal, Master Lucian's commanding voice, which had ordered countless punishments and humiliations over the years, now carried notes of panic as he attempted to organize responses to fires that had progressed beyond any possibility of control. His authority, which had seemed absolute when exercised over enslaved people, proved useless against flames that recognized no distinction between masters and property. Mrs. Noel Draven's refined speech patterns dissolved into incoherent screaming as smoke inhalation combined with terror to reduce her to the kind of desperate animal behavior that she had always claimed distinguished enslaved people from their natural superiors. The social graces that had defined her identity became irrelevant when survival demanded physical capabilities that her pampered lifestyle had never required her to develop. Young Siren Halreth, whose sadistic treatment of enslaved people had revealed psychological problems that his parents preferred to ignore, discovered that violence directed toward fires proved as ineffective as it was inappropriate. His attempts to break through barriers that flames had created demonstrated the same poor judgment that had characterized his treatment of human beings who had been unable to defend themselves against his arbitrary cruelty. Saphira Dreneth's apparent sympathy for enslaved people's suffering, which had always been conditional on maintaining her own privileged position, transformed into accusations that someone had deliberately set the fires that were destroying her family's wealth and social status. Her final words revealed the underlying racism that had always characterized her supposedly enlightened attitudes toward people she had considered naturally inferior. The guests who had spent the evening celebrating American freedom while maintaining investments in human bondage found themselves experiencing the kind of helplessness and terror that they had inflicted on others through systematic oppression disguised as benevolent paternalism. Judge Kalen Stravik's legal expertise proved useless against fires that followed physical laws rather than statutes designed to protect slaveholder interests. Colonel Valentino Ordrich's military training in suppressing slave rebellions had not prepared him for circumstances where the rebellion took the form of systematic destruction rather than armed resistance that could be countered through superior firepower and tactical advantage. His commands to organize bucket brigades fell on deaf ears as people focused on individual survival rather than collective response. Maris completed her work as flames reached the second floor, transforming the mansion's interior into conditions that made survival impossible for anyone who remained inside. Her escape route led through the kitchen and servants' quarters toward the river, where other enslaved people were already beginning their journey toward freedom that had finally become possible through actions that conventional resistance could never have achieved. The explosions from the cellar announced the fires, complete victory over 8 years of accumulated wealth as stored flammable materials ignited simultaneously, sending flames hundreds of feet into the night sky while ensuring that nothing would remain of Thornfield Estate except ash and memories of what happened when human bondage finally encountered its natural consequences. As Maris reached the safety of the tree line that bordered the plantation's cultivated fields, She turned for one final look at the monument to human oppression that was dissolving into the night sky like a prayer answered by forces that recognized no distinction between masters and property, when justice finally received its due recognition through fire that burned everything equally. The morning sun rose on July 5, 1857, to reveal a landscape forever changed by the previous night's liberation. Where Thornfield Estate had stood as a monument to human bondage, only the brick chimney remained upright among acres of ash and twisted metal that marked the end of 83 years of systematic exploitation. The skeletal remains of cotton warehouses stood like tombstones in fields where enslaved people had labored without compensation to build wealth they would never share, while the mansion's foundation stones lay scattered across ground that would never again support the kind of luxury purchased with human suffering. Sheriff Nelson Velthar arrived at dawn with a contingent of white men whose primary concern was preventing the spread of rebellion, rather than investigating the fire's origins with any genuine interest in uncovering truth. The scene that greeted them defied easy explanation, since the systematic nature of the destruction suggested planning and coordination that challenged every assumption about enslaved people's capabilities and intentions. The complete absence of survivors from the white community meant that no witnesses remained to provide testimony about the events that had transformed one of Georgia's most prosperous plantations into a monument to the consequences of human oppression. The investigating party found evidence of multiple ignition points that indicated deliberate arson rather than accidental fire, but the complete destruction of all structures made determining specific details impossible without testimony from people who had witnessed the events. The enslaved quarters stood empty, with clear signs that their inhabitants had departed in organized fashion rather than fleeing in panic, suggesting advanced knowledge of the fires that would soon consume their owners' property. Dr. Jareth Fenlorn, serving as the county coroner, conducted examinations of remains that revealed death by smoke inhalation for all white victims, indicating that the fires had spread too rapidly for escape once they achieved sufficient intensity. His preliminary count confirmed 11 bodies, including the entire Orval family and their Independence Day guests. But the investigation revealed no trace of the enslaved people who had comprised the plantation's primary population. The absence of Maris Elthorne from among either the victims or the survivors created particular concern for investigators who understood that house servants possessed intimate knowledge of plantation operations that would make them valuable assets for anyone planning systematic destruction. Her literacy skills, which had been discovered during the investigation, marked her as someone capable of the kind of planning that had made the fires so devastatingly effective. Sheriff Velthar's official report, filed 3 days after the fire, concluded that the disaster had resulted from Independence Day fireworks that had accidentally ignited stored cotton, creating a chain reaction that spread to other buildings before effective suppression could be organized. This explanation satisfied no one who examined the evidence closely, but it provided a narrative that avoided addressing the implications of successful slave rebellion, while protecting the broader community from panic that might destabilize the entire regional economy. The conspiracy of silence that protected this official version required active participation from everyone with influence in Whitmore County's power structure. Judge Kalen Stravick's death in the fire had eliminated one voice that might have demanded more thorough investigation, while Colonel Valentino Ordrich's absence removed the military expertise that could have organized effective pursuit of escaped enslaved people. The remaining leadership had strong incentives to prevent detailed examination of events that revealed their own vulnerability to resistance from people they had considered completely powerless. Governor Joseph Brown received reports about the Thornfield fire within a week, but political calculations dictated that state-level intervention would draw unwanted attention to an incident that was better forgotten as quickly as possible. Official acknowledgement that enslaved people could successfully destroy an entire plantation would encourage similar actions throughout Georgia, while potentially inspiring resistance movements that could threaten the state's economic foundation. The insurance investigation proved more thorough than law enforcement efforts, since financial interests demanded accurate assessment of losses that would determine compensation for surviving heirs. These private investigators discovered evidence of systematic preparation that pointed unequivocally toward deliberate arson, but their findings remained confidential to protect the insurance industry from claims that might result if plantation fires were officially recognized as successful slave rebellions rather than random accidents. The escaped enslaved people from Thornfield had vanished into Georgia's river systems and swamplands with the thoroughness that suggested advanced planning and intimate knowledge of terrain that provided concealment from organized pursuit. Search parties organized by neighboring plantation owners found no trace of the 89 people who had disappeared on the night of the fire, despite efforts that extended across 3 counties and involved dozens of armed white men experienced in tracking fugitive slaves. Some of the escapees eventually reached freedom in northern states or Canada through underground railroad networks that had been strengthened by abolitionists who understood the significance of successful large-scale resistance to slavery. Their testimonies, recorded years later by anti-slavery societies, provided detailed accounts of life at Thornfield that contradicted every claim that slaveholders made about the benevolent nature of human bondage. Others remained in Georgia, disappearing into communities of free people of color who provided protection and new identities that allowed them to build lives beyond the reach of slaveholder authority. Their presence in these communities created networks of resistance that would prove valuable during the Civil War when enslaved people throughout the South began abandoning plantations to seek freedom with advancing Union forces. Maris herself became a figure of legend whose fate remained unknown even to those who had escaped alongside her from Thornfield's burning buildings. Some accounts placed her in Canada, where she had become a speaker for anti-slavery organizations that used her story to demonstrate slavery's fundamental brutality. Others claimed she had remained in the South, continuing to organize resistance activities that resulted in additional plantation fires throughout the late 1850s. The reality of her disappearance mattered less than the symbolic power of her story, which spread through enslaved communities across the South with the speed and persistence of wildfire itself. The account of one woman who had chosen justice over survival became a source of hope for people trapped in similar circumstances, proving that even the most powerless could claim agency when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Within 6 months of the Thornfield fire, similar incidents had occurred at plantation properties across Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, each bearing the same characteristics of systematic preparation and complete destruction that made official explanations of accidental causes increasingly implausible. The authorities' response was to intensify security measures while maintaining public denial that slave rebellions were responsible for the mounting property losses. These copycat fires served multiple purposes beyond their immediate destruction of slaveholder wealth. They demonstrated that Thornfield's destruction was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of resistance that could emerge anywhere that human bondage created sufficient desperation. They also provided practical benefits by disrupting plantation operations, while creating chaos that enabled additional escapes by people seeking freedom. The economic impact extended far beyond the direct property losses, as insurance companies began refusing coverage for plantation properties, while banks grew reluctant to provide credit for agricultural investments that might disappear overnight. The uncertainty created by these fires contributed to capital flight from rural areas towards cities where investments seemed more secure from the kind of resistance that systematic oppression had finally provoked. Religious communities faced particular challenges in responding to events that seemed to demonstrate divine judgment upon slavery while contradicting Christian teachings about forgiveness and nonviolence. Some ministers interpreted the fires as evidence that God had withdrawn blessing from the peculiar institution, while others insisted that Satan was tempting enslaved people into violence that would destroy their souls along with their masters' property. The newspaper coverage of plantation fires revealed deep divisions within white society about how to address resistance that had moved beyond individual acts of defiance into coordinated campaigns that threatened the foundation of the slave-based economy. Some editors called for increased military suppression of slave populations, while others suggested that voluntary emancipation might prevent more violent confrontations between masters and their human property. Northern abolitionists seized upon stories of plantation fires as evidence that slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction, using accounts of successful resistance to argue that the peculiar institution was inherently unstable and morally bankrupt. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about what he termed the natural consequences of systematic oppression, predicting that violence would continue until human bondage was completely abolished. Southern intellectuals responded by developing increasingly elaborate justifications for slavery that portrayed resistance as evidence of enslaved people's inability to appreciate the benefits of bondage rather than as rational responses to systematic exploitation. These arguments convinced few people outside the slaveholding class, while revealing the desperation of ideologues who could not acknowledge the fundamental contradictions in their worldview. The political implications of successful slave resistance became increasingly significant as sectional tensions mounted during the late 1850s, with Southern politicians demanding federal protection for slavery, while Northern leaders questioned whether the Union could survive half slave and half free. The fires had demonstrated that slavery was not the stable foundation for society that its defenders claimed, but a system that generated the violence necessary for its own destruction. The approaching presidential election of 1860 would occur in a context shaped by events like the Thornfield Fire, which had revealed slavery's vulnerability to the kind of resistance that systematic oppression inevitably provoked. The question was no longer whether human bondage could be maintained indefinitely, but whether its abolition would come through political processes or through the violence that people like Maris Elthorne had chosen when peaceful alternatives proved inadequate. Today, historians recognize the plantation fires of the late 1850s as crucial precursors to the Civil War that would finally end slavery throughout the United States. The individual acts of resistance that began with Maris Elthorne's Independence Day Rebellion had demonstrated that enslaved people possessed both the capability and the determination to fight for freedom when legal and political systems failed to provide justice. The site where Thornfield Estate once stood remains an empty field, marked only by a historical plaque that mentions the tragic fire that claimed the lives of a prominent Georgia family without acknowledging the systematic human exploitation that had made their wealth possible. But among people who understand the full history, the location serves as a reminder that oppression always contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that justice, however long delayed, will eventually find expression through people who refuse to accept injustice as permanent. The Fire Girl's legacy lives on in every act of resistance against systematic oppression, proving that even the most powerless can claim agency when circumstances demand action that transcends individual survival. Her story reminds us that freedom is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right that must sometimes be claimed through fire when all other methods fail to achieve justice. We're only beginning to understand the full scope of resistance to slavery. The next case will reveal even more about how oppressed people fought back against impossible odds. Subscribe to discover the hidden history they don't teach in schools. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.